Luigi Lobaccaro is a postdoc researcher at the Department of Philosophy and Communication at the University of Bologna. Lobaccaro is a postdoc researcher at the Department of Philosophy and Communication at the University of Bologna. His main research interests are in the areas of interpretive and cognitive semiotics for cognitive sciences and psychopathology. Specifically, his work focuses on the sense-making processes in schizophrenia, including the study of schizophrenic language, the relationship between schizophrenic narratives and the bodily experience, and the cognitive semiotics of delusions. He is currently involved in the European Erasmus Plus Neo project. Also, he collaborates with the International Center for Humanities Umberto Eco, the Center for Knowledge and Cognition, and the Center for Enactivism and Cognitive Semiotics. His publications include Ai confini del senso, la schizofrenia tra semiotica, psicopatologia e scienze cognitive, as his dissertation thesis for Alma Mater Studiorum, University of Bologna in 2022. In the same year, he publishes Default Mode Network, Schizophrenia and Narrativity, Comments on Psychopathology of Language in Reti Saperi Linguaggi, Italian Journal of Cognitive Sciences.
Thanks, Maria. Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Professor Leone, Professor Dondero, and Professor Paolucci for the invitation. So in this talk, I will deal with some of the topics that we have heard over the past few days, but from a different point of view. I would say almost overturning the starting and ending points. In fact, we have discussed about the semiotic effects of artificial faces in their becoming more and more real, increasing the ability to lie. Something that Bruno, Remo, Martino, the Professor Pinotti, and many others has spoken about. My intervention, on the other hand, will attempt to investigate what happens at a semiotic level when real face take on the characteristic of an artificial face, and it becomes a sign of something else, of a danger, of a deception, of an absence. And this is what happens in a rare psychiatric condition identified in 1923 by the psychiatrist Joseph Capgras, that is known as the Capgras syndrome. People with the Capgras syndrome form the belief that a friend or a family member has been replaced by a perfect and indistinguishable replica that wants to deceive them. The Capgras delusion typically arises with one particular person, with only one particular person, but the number of the imposters could increase over the time. Often, the delusion is more specific. The role of the imposter can be assumed by animals, aliens, or robots. Just to give an example of what we are speaking about, one patient believed that his father had been beamed up by a ray of light, and someone different, who looked like her father, had come back in his place. The Capgras syndrome is classified as a delusion not only because the belief is bizarre, but also because it's held with an absolute certainty and any doubts. Additionally, most of the time, the belief is not integrated into a network of other beliefs and does not reconfigure the patient's encyclopedic knowledge. One could say, using classification of abductive types, that is a form of belief based on a creative abduction that doesn't generate any form of meta-abduction. In fact, in most cases, this bizarre belief does not have any consequence in the life of patients who, for example, do not seek or worry about the supposed missing relatives. Other times, however, these delusions led to episodes of violence against the perceived doubles. A particularly striking case is the one of a schizophrenic patient who cut his father's throat in search of the electronic wires that control the robotic replica. So, since the early 90s, a lot of studies on this topic have generated among scientists and philosophers the conviction that the study on the anatomical and cognitive function of Capgras would have revolutionized our understanding of human cognition. However, over time, the promises have become mysteries, and what was supposed to be an explanans is now an explanandum. I believe that this phenomenon is a very interesting case for the themes of this conference for two reasons. The first is that because it directly involves the theme of the face and its effects of meaning, showing another way in which faces modifies the borders between artificiality and reality. And the second is that it clearly remarks a classic problem in cognitive semiotics, that is the link between perception and judgment. So observe this patient claim, he looks exactly like my father, but he really isn't. He's a nice guy, but he isn't my father, doctor. He sees the father, but he isn't able to judge him like his father. So these 2 points, the face and the link between perception and judgment, are the central theme of the paragraph of Cantor and the Platypus, physiognomic types for individuals. Here I cannot summarize the essential thesis of Eco's book, but it will be enough to remember that part of the argumentation concerns the functioning of perception that is divided between a primary iconism that works with a stimulus-response mode and a phase of schematization in which the percept is semiotically elaborated and transformed into a cognitive type responsible for recognizing and classifying the perceived object. In the paragraph 3.7.7, his main aim is to construct a theory of physiognomic types for individuals in order to explain how we can recognize Giorgio as Giorgio. Eco argues that in order to recognize an individual, it's necessary to create a scheme, a physiognomic type that is a sort of abstraction of salient features, a gestalt of a face that allows us to quickly recognize individuals without needing to focus on specific details of appearance. Now, if certainly Eco's theory allows to provide an explanation, however debatable, to the case in which in front of Giorgio I can say this is Giorgio, certainly it does not allow to explain what happens when Giorgio is my husband and I affirm this is not Giorgio but a robot with the appearance of Giorgio who is trying to deceive me. In elaborating his theory on physiognomic types, Eco appeals to studies on prosopagnosia, saying that much pathological behavior does little more than emphasize normal tendency. So by understanding that, we can understand how standard cognition works. For this reason, I'm pretty sure that if he had referred to studies on Capgras syndrome, his theory would have been completely different. This is because the most popular neurocognitive theories for explaining the Capgras conceive it as a mirror image of prosopagnosia. These theories start from the idea that the recognition of faces is implemented in a neuronal network composed of 2 paths. One dorsal, mainly dedicated to guided action and spatial vision, and one ventral dedicated to cognition. The ventral pathway is directly connected to the limbic system and the amygdala, which manage the valencies and unsilences in face perception. Studies on prosopagnosia have shown that in patients, the circuit related to the ventral pathway doesn't work, which makes impossible what is defined an over-recognition of the face. Instead, the dorsal pathway and the connection with the limbic system remains intact, allowing for a covert recognition that is expressed through a preference for known face over unknown face. On the other hand, studies on patients with head injuries who have developed the Capgras have shown that the connection between the ventral circuit and the limbic system is compromised. This does not allow the normal valencies relative to the covert recognition of the face. So, according to the influential hypothesis of Ellis and Young, these findings must lead to a complete reconfiguration of the cognitive theories on face recognition. The new model explains how the covert emotional recognition that adds proprioceptive and affective information to the face processing is fundamental, and it has the same importance of the overt recognition. Now, the lack of activation of the covert system seems to be confirmed by numerous experiments on patients with Capgras, and it's believed to be the main cause of the feelings of estrangement and uncanniness that patients claim to experience when confronted with the face of their relatives. 2 fundamental consequences have been derived from this theory, the one from Ellis and Young. The first is that Capgras delusion does not develop merely as a form of erroneous belief, but it depends on a form of anomalous perceptual experience. And the second is the fact that the face recognition is closely linked to affective information. We must therefore note the importance of emotion and affectivity in determining our perceptual grasp on reality. If the cause of Capgras is a lack of affective response that generates a sense of estrangement, we can immediately understand how the implicit stabilization of a person's face as the face of that person depends on emotional factors. In other words, affectivity is crucial in the recognition and the categorization of the face, and a sudden variation of the autonomic response can transform the other's face into its lying image. The real face becomes artificial. What is assumed as a portion of the word suddenly becomes a sign. In semiotic terms, it seems that in the exploration of the face, patients with Capgras move from a perceptive semiotic mood in which the object is approached only through its sensory plane, defined by Eco as alpha mode, to another mode called beta mode, through which to perceive a substance as form, I must first of all presume that it's an expression of a sign function, deliberately produced. In practice, the case of Capgras syndrome is exactly the mirror image of what Martina and Professor Pinotti spoke about. That is the case in which an artificial face can cause a feeling of uncanniness. Now, we are in front of a phenomenon where a feeling of uncanniness causes the perception of an artificial face. However, standard neurocognitive approach struggles to explain exactly what this feeling of uncanniness and estrangement is. Simply stating that there is a lack of emotional response at a subconscious level doesn't explain at all why this would be related to a conscious perception of unfamiliarity. Additionally, it remains completely unclear why these feelings led to the delusion that the person is an imposter or a robot or an alien. Now, this appears even more pressing if we reflect on some elements that I find in the bibliography. Patients with Capgras syndrome are not the only ones to show absent autonomic response in the face recognition. There are indeed other cases of brain injuries that cause reduced activation of the autonomic response, but without generating any delusion. The lack of the autonomic activation is present for every face, but Capgras syndrome manifests itself only in front of the loved ones. Capgras delusion can have different causes. In some cases, they are related to specific neuronal damage that involve the neuronal areas that are related to face recognition. But in the most part of the cases, it's associated with psychopathologies which do not present any scientific evidence of brain damage, like, for example, schizophrenia. The last one is that the Capgras sometimes also manifests itself towards objects, spaces, animals, and it has been shown that in blind people, it also affects voices. So how could it depend on the only autonomic responses that is related to face recognition? So far, every explanatory account has resulted to be largely inadequate in facing these kind of problems. Problems that would be crucial even from an Eckian semiotic perspective, in the sense that it is not clear how, from the non-adherence of the cognitive type to the face token, we pass to the elaboration of such a bizarre narrative. In other words, we are not able to explain the reasons why the subject, failing the typification, decides to use his encyclopedic knowledge to identify a certain face as an alien Giorgio or as a robot Giorgio. Our idea is that the question is most probably misleading, and the error lies in isolating the cognitive function of face recognition by relegating it only to the task of processing external stimuli. In this framework, even the fundamental role of covert emotional recognition is conceived only as an addition of semantic trait in the processing. So, traditional ways of thinking about cognition in classical cognitive science and in cognitive semiotics of Kant and the Platypus may limit our ability to understand this phenomenon. My proposal is that to better understand Capgras syndrome, particularly when it's related to schizophrenia, we need to rethink the way in which we conceive cognition and the role of emotion in our cognitive life. Indeed, the classic idea of perception used in the studies on Capgras has been heavily targeted by contemporary cognitive science, particularly by enactivism, which instead sees perception as an active function determined by the engagement with the world and our sensory motor activity. Martina and Antonis has already introduced these theories in which perception is a form of action and sense-making. Starting from this idea, Paolucci has built a semiotic theory of perception completely opposed to Eco's theory. Paolucci, in fact, points out that when Eco identified the pre-semiotic dimension of perception performed a non-semiotic type of reasoning, forgetting what is the Persian lesson, identifying an aqua as the novelty that kicks us and pushes us to the exercise of interpretation. Eco ignored that for Peirce, what is the something new, the firstness, always emerges from a field of regularity on which it stands, the thirdness. This field of regularities is characterized by motor, perceptual, and interpretive habits that constitute the background of our perception and the way in which the element of novelty can arise. In sum, Paolucci's cognitive semiotics and enactivism conceive the perception as a dynamic action word, and it not only involves the perceptual system, but also encompasses the entire state of the organism in a certain moment, its bodily characteristics, its internal states, embodied motor habits, and its encyclopedic knowledge. All these dynamics constitute a background of possibilities aimed at reducing surprise in an environment and at anticipating possible interactional patterns. These ideas have led even to a new theory of a social cognition known as interaction theory, developed by Sean Gallagher. According to Gallagher, we are able to grasp some feelings, states, and desires of others because they are directly expressed by their behaviors. The perception of others and their emotion is direct and does not require cognitive inference or imaginative simulations, because we are already always embedded in a shared intersubjective dimension, in which understanding the other is the result of a participatory sense-making. In this view, since our earliest years of life, the other is immediately meaningful because it responds to a need for sociality that is evolutionarily scaffolded in our bodies. So, within this framework, we could better understand our innate ability to recognize faces. Faces are the most expressive part of the human body. Through them, we are more capable of handling the intersubjective attunements. When we look to the other's face, we are not searching for signs to infer the emotions of the others or traits to recognize them. No. When we look at the other's face, we are immediately immersed in an interaction whose destiny are uncertain and shared. We need to consider that the dorsal pathway of the face recognition, that is the one that is related to action, has a faster activation than the ventral pathway, that is the one related to recognition. First, we look for possible social affordances, and after we try to recognize who stands in front of us. In this approach, the face has been conceived as a gravitational center of embodied and practical meanings that allow a possible scenario of shared action, as Gianmarco said yesterday. Face is a social affordance that directly involves our embodied expectation, desires, and emotions, and not at least our interpretative habits. A face is a field in which the sense of our shared meaning is played out. Due to this role as a center of condensation for different interactive patterns, the face is always located between nature and culture, as a threshold phenomenon between these two dimensions, as Professor Leone said. In this ecological framework, it's easier to explain our incredible skill to discriminate faces and to understand the utility of an emotional autonomic response in face recognition. The feelings in front of a face are one of the interpretants that helps us understand the way in which we interact with another subject. Is it not true that even many years after the loss of a loved one, even when we can no longer clearly remember his face or voice, we are nevertheless able to evoke the way he made us feel? A phenomenon associated with autism spectrum disorder clearly shows how much this affective and interactive dimension is crucial in recognizing a face. People with ESD have problems with social cognition and are unable to attune to others on a bodily and affective level. We have extensively investigated these aspects in the NEMO project with Professor Paolucci. Recent studies have shown that in autistic individuals, there is a difficulty in recognizing the face of others, with a lot of cases of prosopagnosia. But no lesions are found in recognizing the face of others. So they don't have these problems on the ventral pathway of face recognition. However, this should not be surprising at all. The reason why these individuals do not recognize these faces is because they are not interested in recognizing them. Since the face is firstly a social affordance, it does not have the same salience for individuals who perceive social affordance differently. For SD people, the face does not represent an immediate opportunity for action and for interaction. The lesson is that nobody has to remember what he's not interested in. What then occurs, according to this perspective, in Capgras syndrome? That is our starting point. We have stated that perception is a form of predictive action based on habits, aimed at creating new ones. Face perception is obviously not an exception. We are guided in face recognition by a series of bodily and affective habits determined by our past experience that helps us to anticipate the future of our interaction. How many times do we try to guess the name of a person's faces we have just met? How many times do we think, looking at a face that we don't know, I bet that this guy is named Giorgio? We prepare ourselves to recognize faces in function of the action that we can carry out within an experiential scenario. When we see the face of a loved one, after a long time, our body already projects itself into the act that will follow. We will smell the other before he enters within our olfactory radar. Only the thought of a loved one is enough to put a smile on our face, which is, in fact, a possibility of interaction. I state that the Capgras syndrome in schizophrenia consists precisely in a collapse of this habitual background. Modern phenomenological and enactive theories explain schizophrenia as a disorder that affects synesthesia, causing a decrease in emotions, motor skills, and proprioception, as well as a disorder of the intersubjective dimension and inability to construct meaning with others. Recently, Galese and Ferri called it a disorder of the social bodily self. The word of the schizophrenic is a spectral word in which the possibilities of action and pragmatic meaning are completely lost. Objects in the perceptual field lose their interoperability and become pure things. Everything loses the bodily familiarity through which we act in the world. The psychiatric Thomas Fuchs calls this phenomenon a loss of the familiar meaning. Here, there are two examples of this loss. One more focused on actions and the other more focused on interaction. Let's read together just the second one. It's undeniable that the world appears to be the same. The chair and the table, the trees and the clouds are the same as before. However, everything is different. Their relationship with me, the subject, has changed. All others are innocent, free from blame. Therefore, they distance themselves from me, avoid me, do not want to know anything about me, and leave me alone. In summary, the central point is that this loss causing a feeling of complete disorientation due to the fact that the bodily affective and pragmatic habits have lost their ability to produce meaning. The subject perception of the world and all its expectations have collapsed. They don't work. There is no possibility of making sense because the subject's usual relationship with their body and their world has been lost. If the world loses significance for the subject and the face of the other no longer offers affective possibility, as we have seen, then the face which will generate the strangest feeling would be exactly the one of the loved ones. The contrast between what individual prepare to feel and what it does not feel can only generate the feeling of the uncanny, as understood by Freud, that is the unfamiliarity of familiar. So let's read together this pass from the autobiography of Schizophrenic Girl. I knew her name and everything about her, yet she appeared strange, unreal, like a statue. I saw her eyes, her nose, her lips moving, heard her voice, and understood what she said perfectly. Yet, I was in presence of a stranger. But is it really she, this woman who is speaking, gesticulating? I see her shining white teeth, her brown eyes looking at me, and I perceive a statue by my side, a puppet, part of the pasteboard scenery, What fear, what anguish. I say to her, why do you behave like an automaton? The protagonist, Lenain, explained how the significance of the other space is lost, becoming a mannequin, an automaton, no longer capable of emanating vitality and social affordances. This led to the feeling of estrangement. In phenomenological terms, this can be seen as a change in the affective atmosphere of the world. In neuroscientific terms, it's a disruption of the science that generates predictive errors. And in semiotic terms, it is a crisis of the thirdness that holds the possibility of action within an experiential scenario. However, I think that the enactive approaches to this problem have limitation in explaining how this phase of doubt moved to the subsequent phase that is called delusional perception. No? The one in which the delusion is realized and revealed its final form. It is when one goes from the feeling of estrangement to the perception of a robot or an alien or an imposter. I believe that in order to accomplish this task, it's possible to rely on a semiotic theory of perception that can explain how we arrived at what Jaspers called a sudden and instantaneous new experience of meaning. In our opinion, this is all related to the change in the semiotic dimension that the feeling of estrangement brings with it. We have already said how we can think of a change in the flow of meaning, passing from an alpha mode of phase perception to a beta mode. It's unfamiliarity that generates a state of doubt that must be resolved. The relationship between proprioception, interoception, and exteroception are completely altered in the world of schizophrenia. In Capgras syndrome, the phase of the loved one, dynamically attracts the result of this alteration. The phase becomes the pretext for establishing a new interactive scenario that brings the flow of meaning back to normality, a new form of meaningful perception. The subject must manage a sense that unravels. Thus, the subject is forced to resolve a state of doubt that is not compatible with any interpretive tools at his disposal. He must recreate the background to anchor the overflowing of meaning. In his theory of semiotic perception, Professor Paolucci explains that when the semiotic prediction projection system fails, one can only try new attunements with the word and the others, new attempts of sense-making in order to manage the engagement with the world. The subject must therefore refigure through the imagination what is experiencing in order to give a coherent schema to act in a situation. He has to build a narrative version of the world that is meaningful and at the same time adheres with his experience. For Paolucci, meaning in perception works through a process of imaginative sense-making that transforms environmental cues into clues. The delusional subject must create a new code in order to perceive. He must imagine a possible world in order to restore a new figuration to what he perceives as meaningless. The delusional subject is a subject who must find clues in an environment crowded by very strange cues. He must therefore attempt new enactment, that is to say, a new way of understanding the world and relating to it, but a world that has its specific and idiosyncratic meanings. The schizophrenic subject must therefore elaborate a ratio for this type of experience. He has to systematize the meaning by connecting the experiential scenario to a narrative that allows stabilizing the perception and revealing it. He has to find the key, said the psychiatric Conrad. But there is no other place to find this rule, to find this key, than his individual encyclopedia. So what he does? He has to search in his previous encyclopedic knowledge to find something that is comparable to his sensation. He needs an affective diagram that builds commensurability to stabilize and understand the experience. He could find something useful into those encyclopedic portions built by the cinema, the literature, the video games, in which he could find the commensurable sensation, a feeling useful as an interpretant that could say that this feeling is the same of what someone else feels. Literature, cinema, fairy tales, myths are full of stories in which there are imposters, aliens, and robots. represented as figures that pretend to be what they are not, that have already created the feeling of eeriness and uncanniness in the psychotic subject. They could be used. Giorgio may then become an alien who wants to kidnap the patient, an imposter who wants to kill him, or a perfect robot replica. The narrative and the experience must co-adapt and co-modify. This configuration creates a possible scenario that satisfies the subject and generates what the psychiatric Rossimonti calls the cleansing of experiential anxiety. The idea of an imposter, an alien, or a robot, however bizarre, quiets the state of doubt, gives meaning to the situation, and refigures a possible world. A world in which the meaning of an artificial face is preferred to a real face without meanings. Aliens, robots, and imposters are figures of the imagination that help the delusional subject to conceive the unimaginable. Thank you for the attention.